Yes, ma'am. I think
I got my banana,
flipper,
a laptop,
Mikey's
candy.
laptop's working.
Which flavor? Thank you.
This is candy made with hops.
Okay, hops candy.
Oh, you made this yourself? Oh. Thank you for sharing.
You want to do it?
Yeah, do it. You're up. Good afternoon, GROW. This is the GROW session of IETF 106 in Singapore. If you're not supposed to be in Singapore, look for help. I very, very much appreciate that all of you have been pulling through the entire week and are sitting here at the last session slot of IETF. I think we can all agree that in the random pick, we have drawn the far side of the spectrum compared to the last meeting, which was on a Tuesday. But I would suggest let's go through our materials and participate in the GROW working group session. This is the note well. You may have seen it a few times before. As part of the note well, please make sure that you write your name on the blue sheets, name and affiliation. And when we think we have captured everybody, please return the blue sheets to us. These are resources relevant to the working group. Our agenda is online, the materials for the agenda. We have a mailing list, a Jabber room, and this brings me to the point of looking for a volunteer to be Jabber scribe. So anybody in the room able to connect to the Meet Echo website and monitor the Meet Echo Jabber room. Warren, thank you for that. We also need a minutes taker. Would anybody want to take the minutes for this session?
Jordy looks like a minute taker.
All right.
Sweet. Thank
We're
you.
appointing Jared Mauch as the minutes taker of this session. Thank you, Jared. Okay, blue sheets are being filled in. Minutes taker assigned, Jabber scribe assigned. Any agenda bashing? Are people comfortable with the agenda as presented? Don't fall off.
We're going to dance a little bit. Okay, for those of you presenting, this is the mic. It goes near your face. If you do this and go like that, no one can fucking hear you. Please hold the mic in your hand. It will not bite you. Speak into the mic. Stand onto the seven perpendicular lines, 5 of which are transparent, so that Medico can see you. That's it. Whoop. Okay. We have some existing drafts. Here's the status for them. You can look at the tools page to delve deeper if you prefer. The 2 question marks for adopt is, I think we forgot to send that to the ISG. We have a couple of things that are ISG to send to the ISG. We just forgot to do that. Emails from the authors are always helpful in this regard. You want to talk about the charter?
Yeah, let's cover that. If you're monitoring the mailing list, we are undertaking an effort to recharter the working group to bring it up to date with the modern world. The last rechartering effort stems from, I think, at least 15 years ago. So it would be good to assess whether what GROW is doing in practice still aligns with the charter and align the charter with reality. The input mechanism to this discussion is via the mailing list. We will not be taking this, decisions in this meeting. But yeah, check out the mailing list, read the proposed charter and reflect your thoughts on that. For those of you who don't know what a charter is, a charter defines the purpose of the working group. That purpose is then expressed in goals, which brings it slightly closer to tangible action items. And then in terms of action items, those are called milestones. So we go from the most abstract, the charter, to goals, to milestones, which are actionable things on which we can measure our performance. Now, it is very, it's a cultural aspect of IETF to wildly deviate from the milestones. That's okay. We don't need to make it an exhaustive list, but it is good for newcomers to have an understanding of what this working group does, what the direction of the work of the working group is, and what we consider important to work on in the future. So that covers the charter. Existing drafts in the IDR session, we brought up that maximum prefix limits no longer belongs in GROW, so we can strike through that. We have published some drafts as RFCs. Congratulations to the working group and the authors for accomplishing that work. And I will not venture into all the nitty and gritty details of the workflow. So let's go to presentations. Camilo, your name is up first, so you will be first. This is your clicker.
How was it? Microphone to my mouth?
Microphone to mouth, my friend. Perfect. All right. Which one is yours?
Bmp Market, the last one. Down, down.
Oh, sorry.
Nope. Down, down, down. The last
Down?
one. The last one.
Down.
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 Yeah.
There we go.
Say down 2 more times. Okay.
Perfect. So hello all. This is an update on Bmp Pod Marking. So just as an overview, this draft basically tries to convey the path status of a path in Bmp. Path status meaning whether the path is installed, uninstalled, best path, multipath, ECMP, I don't know, let your imagination fly. It uses the mechanisms of the TLV draft that currently now GROW draft that Paulo will explain later. And well, path status is something that we don't have right now in Bmp. It can actually be obtained, let's say, implicitly from the RIP you source, or I guess doing some comparison between RIPs. That's complicated. That might change depending on the implementation. That's, I don't know. I think it's nice to have explicit mechanisms of marking this information. Now, we also have a reason field. Right now it's a free-form string. I'll discuss that in a second of how that can change. The idea of the reason field is to say why there's a certain path status for a path. And well, I mean, we saw it as a way of troubleshooting, maybe as for a specific use case. Oh, well, let's see. This version basically has editorial changes, but we are thinking of making a, let's say, more drastic change in the next one. Here are some of the changes we might, here. We are thinking about. First of all, Jeff has very clear that probably free-form string is a bit complicated. We had this field as a free-form string because we did not want to parameterize reasons. So path status is actually complex to parameterize. So finding a finite set of states. Now reasons, that sounds very daunting. So, but well, if this is very complex, and I don't know what the experience of the group is with the BGP shutdown feature, so we might need to move this to something else. We're thinking about it, how to do it. Second is the path status length. So right now the path status is a bit field, so you can basically mark different path status, which allows you for having different levels of granularity. But right now it's just 2 bytes. We might, maybe this becomes very successful, and do not laugh. And so maybe in the future we have many path status, so maybe we want to protect the mechanism having the path status being a variable field. We will also think about it. Now, I think we should remove, or we have been discussing that the definition of the actual path status is something that should not fall into this draft. Is quite complex. For instance, multipath. You go and try to look for a document explaining that. It's not easy. Maybe it does not exist. Maybe some draft here and there, but it's not clear stated. So we might not have path status defined in the draft, but hopefully somewhere else, either other draft or, I don't know, YANA or GOT or something. So we might have some paths as examples, but we do not plan to define path status in the draft. And finally, we might add some notes on the optional nature of this feature. So the feature itself is optional, right? You don't have to add it if you don't want. That's the idea. Also, the reason field. So if the reason field, the nature right now of the field is that you don't have to add it if you don't support it or if you don't want to. But it might also fall into the path status. So it might happen that we define many path status, very granular, and an implementation only supports a set of them. And it might be feasible that we somehow, either offline or some other way, that's fine, and that's okay. I mean, maybe you don't support that level of granularity and just a subset of the path status. That's it. I have nothing else to say. If you have any comments or anything else, either here or in the mailing list.
All right, you're safe.
Thank you.
It's the power.
Next up, more entity clowns. Partners, colleagues.
Thank you. So I'm Paolo Lucento from NTT, and I have 4 drafts to present. So first is the lock rib extension of Bmp. It's something relatively old, like started in 2017. We had visibility in lock rib, for Bmp. And, since the last meeting, there has been essentially no changes to the draft. We may have only catched something during the Bmp hackathon on Sunday. I hope Thomas will have the time at the end to comment more on that. It's more recommendation, small gaps. Maybe it's worth adding a few words there, maybe not. So I will not comment more, and maybe it's better Thomas speaks at the end. Any questions? Cool. Then we have the draft about essentially adding TLV support to peer down and route monitoring messages. The problem statement is very, very simple. Like we have a table with 4 legs, and one of the legs is not equal to the others, and so we want to make all the legs equal, right? And so the idea is simply to add that optional TLVs to route monitoring, to peer down, and we bump the version of the protocol just for backward compatibility, right? Since last meeting, the draft got adopted by the working group. Thank you very much. There have been only some minor editorial changes. And if you remember my presentation in Montreal, we did leave kind of on purpose under-specified the peer down, because the peer down is its own beast, right? So it's even more uneven surface than the other messages. And so that got scoped a little bit better. Like you can see the text over there. Essentially, you have code 1 and 3. There is a BGP notification, and then after the notification, you can do the TLV, essentially like you do for the route monitoring. For the code 2, there is a mandatory 2-byte field to give additional information, and after that, you can put the TLV data. And for the other, there is no extra data, so just after the message, you can put the TLVs. And this is it for this draft. Next steps, really, I think it's extremely simple. There is no open questions. If there is no objections, I would just recommend let's wrap this up and last call it and everything. Questions, objections? Shall I follow up? Oh, please.
Yeah.
So looking at the implementers in the room, are we good to go? No?
So?
Jeff has, sure, you can make me stand up and talk. I think there's a desire to try to make this done, soon. The work is, fairly reasonable, fairly straightforward in the grand scheme of things. And I think what you're going to find is this work is the plug-in architecture for a lot of the other stuff you're wanting to try to do for the rest of the group. If you try to finish this now, before the other work sort of cascades into it, you're going to have to do it again.
Cool.
We shall deliberate on what the next step is.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But your request is noted. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Then I have something new compared to the other, IETF 105, which is the support for enterprise-specific TLVs, right? So in the other draft, we are defining the TLVs, and here we are defining a mechanism to have, enterprise-specific, not IANA governed, TLVs. So even before the problem, I already said the problem statement, so I can go ahead. Essentially, so that's the thing. Like you may have some enterprise-specific stuff that you want to carry, and some vendor do and other don't. There is a pre-standardization phase, and so we essentially want to avoid squatting, right? I have already noticed squatting from at least one implementer. I saw a message type 100. So let's say I would just say like it's a nice way forward. It is totally not new work. Like you will see at the end that what I am proposing here is simply borrowed by IPFix and landing that on Bmp. And the other thing is that why we are not merging this with the other draft is because the other draft is scoped to only 2 messages, right? So there was a few logics over there. The other draft is, applies only to 2 messages, and this applies to all of them. And potentially, since it's kind of backward compatible, what we are doing here, since there is no TLVs defined that use the first bit, we can even apply that to BMP version 3 if you want, right? So there were a couple of things that induced us to not merge the 2 works. So for who is not familiar, PANG is a private enterprise number, and that is assigned by IANA, or actually you go request to IANA and IANA gives you one. The goal, I have already said it and things like that. So the TLV governed by IANA, it's super simple, like, it's a TLV like we know it. And you see the first bit, it's the E bit, right? So it's set to 0 if it's IANA governed, and it's set to 1 if it is enterprise specific. And if it is enterprise specific, essentially in the first 4 byte, because the PANG is 4 byte long, the first 4 byte of the value is the enterprise number. And then followed by that, there is the value. To be honest with you, there is not many open questions. As I was saying, I mean, we have just borrowed something existing and working, and we landed it over here. I got comments like, oh, if you do this mechanism, then you want to do it elsewhere in BMP, message types, you want to recommend it for subtypes and whatever. So questions and maybe working group adoption.
John Scudder. We have seen at least one proposal of this kind in IDR also.
Mhm.
And I think it's fine. It's technically a good solution to the problem. The pushback that I've heard in that context basically amounts to, yeah, but when I move my you're sort of proposing it as this is a playground that I can experiment in, and then once my thing is standardized, then I have to go and actually change my packet format, because you had two different headers there.
Yeah.
And which leads me, I guess we have to try it to find out how it actually plays out in the Wild West, right?
Sure.
But there's probably some aphorism like nobody ever got rich, or I can't put it together now, but by underestimating the laziness of software developers.
Yeah.
Which I don't think it's guaranteed that providing this nice structure will get rid of squatting, but I guess we might as well try.
Yeah. Thank you. And, just as a comment on the laziness and whatever, I totally agree with you. We already know what happened with IPFix. So you write on the draft that this is a transitioning mechanism, very nice. And then, code points remain enterprise specific forever, right? So.
Actually, I remember the other half of it. It's like you can be lazy in two directions, right? One is that you can define a code point under your enterprise space. And then be too lazy to ever update into the IANA assigned space, at which point you just, if your thing becomes popular, everybody else has to go and start putting your enterprise numbers into their code base. Or, and maybe you end up putting it into an RFC also. Or the flip side also exists, which is you say, well, I don't want to bother with that enterprise space transition, so I'm just going to squat in a code point anyway. And sort of the end state of that argument is, you had, I think, 2 bytes of IANA assigned space plus 4 bytes of enterprise assigned space. Or
4 bytes of enterprise number, and the 2 bytes.
Yeah. So what you've got there is, if you catenate that, you've just got a 6-byte number. So you could also just be like, yeah, here's your 6-byte first come first served registry, and everybody can, it's so big that you'll never run out of numbers. So just everybody go crazy. That's another way of looking at it.
Jeff, as I think John's referring to work that I did. This was draft IETF. Draft has BGP extended experimental. The key properties in there were that it did actually use the private enterprise numbers as a way to give people their own playground. The other thing that was specifically in there, which some people didn't like, but some people thought was a good idea, is when people pick a magic number within their own enterprise space, because the enterprise space is just the anchor for your own play space. You still have to have an internal registry, which you have to expose the outside world. That's one of the headaches. But people very seldom get a feature right the very first time. So if you assign a feature ID 100 and then change how it behaves, do you simply ship new code under 100 and break everybody? Or do you rev it or choose a new code point? And this sort of devolves back to the talks I've given in a couple of different working groups on managing code points. It's not hard, but if you don't do it rigorously, you cause problems. Second minor point, the majority of my comments on the BMP stuff is going to, I think, devolve down to a few very simple core points. I can take them to the list again. I've been in discussions offline with some of the other authors. But if there's 5 minutes at the end of the agenda, would the chairs entertain a possibility of me talking to the group for 5 minutes?
I think what Chris meant to say is
Yes.
Job Snyders, NCT, speaking as working group participant. The purpose of this organization is to facilitate standardization of specifications so that we have interoperability. I won a bunch of Scrabble points with that sentence. What I worry a little bit about is that if we facilitate the creation of TLVs and stick in pens, and after that it's up to you, that we do not meet that objective, standardizing specifications for the purpose of inter-administrative domain interactions. So the context of PEN to me is that if within your organization, with your applications, you need to do a thingy that is appropriate, but if we have vendors using PEN to push their products, I would much more like to try and bring and keep the group together so that we have one uniform understanding of what BMP is. But I also recognize that squatting is a very undesirable behavior. And one observation is that first come, first serve in a large number space could be very effective. If we lower the barrier to get a number, that will encourage people to just take the number. The enterprise number, it's not a vendor extension number to my mind. It's within one single administrative domain.
Yeah. And the point I essentially have a reply to your point, but also to Jeff's point. So essentially, the reason this kind of makes sense to me, like I understand lowering the bar and everything, is that in the end, this is BMP is not something. A routing protocol is not something that it should be understood by, let's say, two organizations, right? So you are monitoring something, and maybe you want to expose some metadata, and that metadata applies to one vendor but not to the other. So in a way, doing a YANA governance should be realistic, right? So if I want to expose some metadata for something that I do have but another vendor doesn't have, then it is not realistic to standardize it. And this kind of mechanism allows to, not squat. So still the vendors to do their own stuff, but without squatting the public space, right? So, I mean, there are things that, in my opinion, are not realistic to standardize. I don't know. I want to, I don't want to give examples, but there are things that cannot clearly be standardized, and this is a mechanism that can help there.
Jared Mach, Akamai. So I think, Job, one of the points here is that sometimes when we're implementing things, and Akamai, we have a number of our own implementations that pass data around that's important. We kind of need to have a standardized place to put these types of things, even if it's not part of the official IETF standard, is that sometimes there's a need for additional namespace. And I think that's what we've seen with a lot of the other languages like JSON or whatever, where you can actually add additional metadata easily and such. So I understand the sentiment of, we're a standards body and it kind of is a little bit different there, but yeah, I can talk to you afterwards about it.
A very short comment from my side, Jared. What you said just now made me think of what we do with MAC addresses, where we flip the administrative bit, and maybe one bit is sufficient for this purpose that you described.
Rüdiger Volk, Deutsche Telekom. I don't want to go into a discussion right now, maybe at the next meeting, but Jared's remark and pointer to actually make metadata and schema information explicitly managed, I think could change the outlook of what we are doing here. The TLV stuff always means only the guy who defines the code point knows what is going to be in the data structure and the presentation layer. And kind of it would behoove IETF to actually use something where at least the presentation layer is something that is taken care of automatically.
Okay, thank you. I had a fourth draft about compressed route monitoring messages. Please, the slides are online. I'm sorry I cannot present it.
Colin.
Hi. So I'd published this draft just recently. It came from a discussion with Paolo, actually, about for BMP collectors, defining a mechanism to store BMP messages and record them and as a archive format. So I sort of knocked this together as an initial idea, which was to use MRT, which is explicitly designed for that purpose. It's for storing routing protocol transactions, as it refers to it. And well, you know, it's well supported. It's well known for storing BGP data, and especially in things like route views and RIS. And it supports type code, so there was the option of creating a new type code to store BMP messages in MRT so that they can be archived. The initial attempt was basically to just put the message inside a header that says where it came from and who it was sent from and to, and then just put the message in there. Now that's sort of an opening point for discussion, because the main issue with it is that the way MRT files are usually done, they get split by time intervals. Maybe they're split every 5 minutes, and the messages are always standalone. They need to be parsed independently of the previous file and such, which means that the information about the encoding of the BGP update, which is usually based on the capabilities that were negotiated at the beginning of the session, end up needing to be encoded into the MRT format so that the parser knows how to read it. Examples of this being examples being AS4 and ADPath, which alter the wire encoding. Now that kind of leads to the questions that I had, which was where the responsibility for ensuring that lies. There's options of the BMP sender communicating enough information to represent that. This actually led on to the TLV draft that Paolo has, which was adding support for the to add TLV encodings to represent these different adding TLVs to represent all the different encoding types, but they're still optional. Whether or not they should be mandatory so that the messages can always be parsed, whether this draft should just be specified for BMP v4 and ignore, not use it for other versions of BMP, then the receiver can just record the incoming message. Or should the monitoring station, be the one that's writing the message, be responsible for providing the information on how to read this message at a later date? This is an example of what currently happens for the BGP type in MRT, where it basically has a list of permutations that get added to every time the wire encoding changes with a capability, which has happened a couple of times so far. There's still a few more permutations, but it's not the nicest. And yeah, the MRT format has subtypes. We could use the same mechanism as the BGP type to also encode the permutations into the subtypes, or ignore that and define some extra header fields to represent the different encodings. There's then an issue if the MRT header tells you to decode it one way, but there's actually a TLV in the BMP message that says to decode it in a different way. What happens if they don't match? So this was just me kind of starting the thoughts of how to go about solving this, so that the result is that you can store BMP messages in a way that they can be replayed at a later date and know how to encode what was on the wire at the time. Yeah, that's basically it. Does anybody have thoughts on this? The usual list of questions.
Hi, Colin.
Hi.
Rüdiger speaking. What you are talking about is essentially stuff in the presentation layer. Kind of, I'm surprised. My previous remark on doing something on the presentation layer might actually benefit here. No idea how complex it is to transition to something that is more future-proof.
Jeff has, this is worth doing.
Sorry, Jeff, did you comment on Rüdiger Volk's comments or on this presentation? Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll follow up on the list then. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Next up, Yunan Gu.
Hi, this is Yunan Gu from Huawei. So I have 3 drafts to discuss with you today. The first one is the BGP root trace using BMP. Okay, so yeah, this on the 03 draft version, we have Thomas from Swisscom on board, and he has helped prepare this version with a lot of good suggestions, and we can take a look. So here's the changes that we make to the second version. The first big change is that we have tried to restructure the whole format. Previously, the information regarding prefixes and policies and the attributes, they're kind of mixed together. So this time we try to put things where they belong together. And so that's why we come up with a policy TLV, and where we put all the things that related to the policy together, okay? And then we have done some renaming. So the first one is that we changed the previous hop to the root origin. And the second is we changed the VRF table name TLV to VRF table TLV. That's because we add and field to this TLV, which allows you to put the VRF table ID. So you have both the name and the ID. Name better for visualization, and the ID can be used for precise mapping or searching stuff. And we've made this TLV also optional. And then we renamed the optional string TLV to string TLV, and we add an example how we can use this TLV. And we also redefined the policy classifications. Okay, so let me walk you through these TLVs. So the message looks like this. Still, we have the prefix information, and then it comprises of different events. Then for each event, we first have the timestamp information and some other information relates to the prefix. And then we get the table TLV and policy TLV. So above this part, which are it's about the prefix you're monitoring, and about the reason, or it's about the reason how this happens. And so after that, we have the attributes, which are the results of actually the processing. So, and lastly, we have the string TLV to provide you, some freeform C. Okay, can we change the
Heck out there. How about now?
Okay, thanks. So the first TLV is a VRF table TLV. As I said, we add an ID field. And the second one is the policy TLV. So you can see.
Sorry, I don't know why this is misbehaving.
Okay. So this TLV actually is I've made a lot of changes to it. So everything related to policy is put in here. So first of all, we've added 2 flag bits. The first one is still the one we previously have, which is the matching or mismatching bit. It tells you if match condition is met, okay? And then if there's a match of the policy, the P bit will tell you the result of this match is permit or deny. So if it's permit, then we can use the third bit, which is stands for if there's difference or not of the pre and post policy attributes. In other words, it tells you if there are further actions taken regarding the attributes. If you, for example, if you have like changed the next hop or not. So if the D bit is unset, then we shall not include the post policy attribute TLV in the message because it'll be the same as a pre policy. Okay, so and the attribute TLVs are still the same. And for the string TLV, the example is something that I have discussed with Thomas, who thinks that if we don't want to use the policy format we defined in this draft, we probably could use, something that you want to carry to represent your policy. So here, for example, you can use the XPath of your policy models here to represent the policy information, or you can combine both the policy TLV with the string TLV, okay? So, I would like to get some feedbacks from the working group here, which basically are about the future direction of this draft. So, since I've talked to different people, and I do see, different opinions or comments on the draft. Some think, this draft is a little bit overcomplicated, and maybe it can target a very specific use case. But some others think, well, it's good. I can get all the information I need, and maybe you can do something in the server side to extract information you need to insert into different apps. So yeah, this is something that I want to ask the working group to help refine the drafts. And the second is use case, and so I think the direction should be use case driven. So shall we identify some use cases to help converge the draft? Yeah, so that's for the first draft. Any comments?
Rüdiger Volk again. I'm really surprised. I did not intend and foresee this. Yunan, you're mentioning that this looks complicated or complex. The actual content and intention and use certainly has complexity, and I'm not completely sure whether I'm really happy to go there. But following up to my previous 2 remarks, the complexity that comes in by the customized presentation layer certainly does not help a lot. I very much would like to see an approach like define your complex data structure in something like CDDL, and if you want to have a dense binary encoding, use just the CBOR encoding and parsing mechanism. And let's not talk about the presentation layer and the parsing anymore, and just lift up the discussion to more of a semantic level where we would be talking about symbolic fields and data structures and stuff like that. Kind of, yes. Again, like in my previous remark, it is not completely clear whether this is the guinea pig to try to do this the first time, but looking at the complexity of the presentation, I actually think, yes, it would be a very interesting guinea pig.
Thank you. I actually didn't quite get your comments, but I'll check later.
Job Snyder's NTT wanting to respond to Rudiger. I think it is an interesting notion if we could get to a higher level of discussion to focus less on what does this bit on the wire mean and more talk about symbolic meanings. That is an admirable goal. You suggested CBOR. It is on my to-do list to go to the CBOR working group because as far as I understand, they don't have primitives such as an IP prefix, an IP address, and other things. And I think we would do ourselves a disservice if we put a byte string encoded in CBOR into our protocols. So there may be some opportunity to improve CBOR to make it more useful for our use cases. It is extensible, and that's why we need to go to that working group.
Jeff Haas, and specifically responding to that, it's the exact same comment I made to partially adjust the Chris Morrow on the mailing list. There's a lot of binary encodings that are wonderful for transport. They give you encapsulation, that's great, but the presentation layer on top of them is not rigorous enough for our applications. It's fine for us to specify things in Yang and have them actually rendered in a different format because it provides a hint to the underlying code how to do the rendering. Just because it's a byte string underneath, if you tell it in the Yang layer that's an IP address, this means that code that actually is eating CBOR can parse CBOR, notice that maps the underlying IP type, and run the validator in that format.
And for those of you that don't know what CBOR is, it is the concise binary object representation. Think of it as JSON in binary encoding.
All right, thanks. So the second draft I'm going to discuss is BMP for rule leak detection. So, well, I've been trying to get a figure that best represents where this draft stands. It might be a little ugly to watch, but I'll walk you through it. So, so first of all, this draft is a rule leak detection method, and it allows you to detect the leaks that happen in your local AS, not the upstream or downstream. And it allows you to find the issues that happens at the egress SBR. So maybe the egress here is misused by, I want to express the, the propagation direction of the route. For example, in this figure, the router 4. So if we have done some, inbound or outbound policy is configured here, and the route, for example, received from your provider is errorly sent to another provider. And then for such case, we can use this draft to identify the leak, okay? And a few considerations or say, I think benefits of this draft is that, first of all, it's a single ISP deployable. You don't need to have corporations or dependencies of things from other ISPs. And the second good thing is that you don't need to rely on some database lookup and stuff like that. And the third thing is that this kind of detection is prefix level. And for this point, I will have a question. I have a question for the working group in the later page. And the third good thing is that from my understanding at least, it doesn't overlap or conflict with some of our existing methods, and actually they can like be complementary to each other, as something I've pictured in this figure. Okay. So here are the changes we've made in the 4 versions. So what we want to do is generally proposing a TLV that carries the appearing relation information. And so in the latest version, we name it as the RLD TLV. And we have defined currently 4 types of appearing relations. Okay. So my question here is that, so is the use case that I've put in the first page a issue that happens a lot in the network? And if yes, is BMP a good way to do so? And also, which is about the third benefit I have mentioned about using BMP, is that it is a prefix level detection. So shall we do like just BGP session detection or prefix level? Because if we want to do just BGP session level, then we probably don't need any extensions, because the open policy allows you to exchange the roles, and then it's carried in the peer up messages, so you have the information. But the best thing is that you cannot represent some complex cases where some prefixes don't obey to the session-based relations. So if we want to do the prefix level, well, the thing is, should we like specify where we can get such prefix level peering relations in this draft, or just leave it outside? Yeah, so I would like some suggestions.
Alexander Azimov, Yandex. First of all, thank you for covering some of my comments in the slides. I need to admit that since your draft at the moment relies on BGP roles to get information about peering relations, there is no option to get roles per prefix, because it's it doesn't work like this. If you are not going to add another TLV, you can end up in a situation when you are not suggesting standard track, but you are suggesting something like a BCP, how to use BMP, and it's not limited only for route leak detection.
Yeah, so as I put it as a question, should we do just BGP session level?
Yeah, you know my position. Yeah. I would prefer to have a draft that will describe common use cases for BMP, because at the moment there is no such work. And with what we have as a signals that can be used, we may end up with 1, 2, 3 signals, and to get them in BMP before we apply a mitigation policy makes sense for me.
Thanks.
Jared Mach, Akamai. I think one of the biggest challenges in discussing this is that what actually defines a route leak is highly business specific. It's not just about the ASPA role or about stuff, because an individual prefix, in one case you may actually want to let out, and you may not want to let other prefixes through. And that business logic is something that may be unique to the individual company, and I think is something that's very hard for outsiders to infer what the actual intent is without intent-based routing, which is really what BGP is. I've sent you the NRLI. My intent is that you please route this. And I think that is the challenge in how do you identify these, is that we don't have a good understanding of how to communicate this to each other, and there's a lot of granularity that can exist in it. And we have a lot of tools that we're using to do this, be it BGP communities or something else, to try and prevent these types of things. But I think that's one of the biggest, I think, challenges with this type of a draft is BMP is an excellent protocol for monitoring stuff, but what you're trying to monitor is the intent, and the intent is that business logic. And that's going to be unique. It's going to be different for Akamai versus Yandex versus Deutsche Telekom, NTT, GTT, whoever else.
Thanks for the comment. So if no other comments, let's move to the last one, okay? So the last draft is about enhanced AS loop detection for BGP routes. So the changes to the previous version is that we have converged our proposals to two options for both inbound and outbound policy processing. So the first option is that when you detect a route with AS loop, then you do some analyze based on some local database. And the second option would be you use BMP extension to export the routes with AS loops. So the first one does not need any changes to existing protocols, and the second one we have proposed to use the mirroring message with a new code type for the information TLV to carry the routes with AS loop detected. So you can put the routes with loop after the TLV type, and as in the last field. So that's it. And as have discussed this case with Alex previously, and he mentioned some news cases. The draft was previously intended for detecting hijack cases, and Alex mentioned something that you can use also such detection to find some configuration errors of your neighbor ASs, if I understand it right. And I think, Alex, you can send the case to the mailing list for further discussion, or you might want to bring it up now.
Alexander Azimov, Yandex. So my message was that the way it is stated in the draft, so you are taking into account BGP updates, where is your own autonomous system number in the IS path, is not limited to the scope of what is called in the draft hijacks, or I will call it route leaks, because it may also happen when some of your prefixes are rejected by your upstream provider, and they are sending you back these prefixes that are received from other side. It's also may highlight that there is some policy issue, but so the scope is not limited to only hijacks or route leaks BGP anomalies. At the same time, speaking about hijacks, it also seems very native to use BMP to detect, for example, prefixes that are not announced by your autonomous system number, but use your address space, because they will also be rejected. And so use BMP as a general purpose monitoring system for BGP anomalies. And these can be added to your previous draft. So I believe that BMP has a lot of options and to be used. And with getting experience, how it can be used, what information can be easily retrieved for this kind of monitoring, can be moved into informational draft that would be very interesting for the industry, and also make a help for BMP to take up to get a higher rate of deployment.
Yeah, thank you.
Thomas Graf, Swisscom. Maybe just one another use case I just came up with is why not just not only restrict it to AS paths, you could also think about the site of origin, for example.
Thanks. Very good suggestion. Yeah, so that's it.
Thank you very much for your presentations. Now we get to the improvisation aspect of this session. I would like to invite the hackers from the BMP Hackathon for a 5-minute update on their hackings. I also saw that some people entered the room after this session started. Please make sure that you sign the blue sheets if you are in this room.
Hi, everybody. Thomas Graf from Swisscom. You might have noticed that on Saturday, Sunday, we had the hackathon. And the goal from our group was basically to do some interoperability testing between collector and routers in terms of BMP local RIP and adjacency RIP out. We could use an updated Wireshark BMP dissector and PMACCT to validate that. Basically with a simple setup here with 3 routers, and identified some, let's say, interesting things which we put on the mailing list and would like to encourage you to give us some feedback. One thing was about BMP local RIP. When a router has a local originated route in its local RIP, we noticed that the next hop attribute, depending on the vendor, might be different. It's either like 127.0.0.1 or 0.0.0. RFC 4279 doesn't really specify what the next hop attribute should be when it's directly exposed from the router. When it's propagated out of the router, there were some definitions there, so we would like to understand what are the different vendor implementations here and where it might be some help to update the BMP local RIP draft for some informational elements there. Another thing which we found was regarding adjacency RIP out. There seems to be different vendor implementations regarding the peer up message. Depending if post and pre-policy is configured or not, depending on the implementation, we have one or more peer up messages with different peer headers. So also please on the mailing list feedback us if you think that either both is acceptable or we should clearly define whether we should in this case just get one peer up messages or if multiple peer up messages is the desired result. Well, we will go on, and in the next Hackathon 107, we can continue to validate some future drafts regarding path marking, route policy, attribute tracing, and new Tlvs. And that was the group. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. That is a cool report and a nice photo.
Paolo, you said you had one, we cut you off. You want to come do that, and then we'll hear from Jeff? Yeah. We have, I think we thought we had only an hour, and we have an hour and a half, so we have another 20 minutes or so.
Right. And so this is the 4th draft that I wanted to present. It's an effort that we are doing together with Mukul from Juniper. It's about compressing route monitoring messages. So it is believed that, let's say, BMP may generate a lot of data, especially with AdRibbing, AdRibOut, lockrib, pre and post policies, Tlvs, and all of that. And then essentially the proposal, I would say, is quite simple, quite intuitive. It's just like you flag compression information in the init message using the Tlvs there. You have a new message type because, of course, this is not compatible with existing route monitoring messages, and essentially apply this draft that is at IDR about compressed BGP updates, but essentially implement that to BMP. So that was it. I'm just looking forward to feedback. Is it a good work? Is it not a good work? Is it worth pursuing? I see maybe a yes. Thank you.
The group may need some time to read and digest the draft.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Oh, we have two comments at the mic.
John Scudder. So I hadn't heard of this work prior to the beginning of this meeting, so I quickly went and looked at the draft. It's admirably short. I had read the Tony's draft in IDR previously, and I like that work. So sort of by extension, I like this work too. The one warning is that just sort of as, you know, kind of a process thing, Tony's draft is still an individual submission. So if you move ahead, we'll probably need to figure out, you know, how to make sure that your references are all in order, but we can take care of that, you know, in the future.
Thank you.
Ignas Bogdanas Equinix speaking as a working group member and a happy user of compressed BMP. Yes, this is needed. This addresses a real problem in the field, and not necessarily the lack of capacity on the bits on the pipe, but on the processing side of the received BMP messages. Couple of comments. What you are proposing is to compress one single message, and the results, if you would compress a vector with the same dictionary, would be noticeably better. So maybe your structure needs to have a definition for a stream or a set of BMP messages to be compressed. Now, the other thing about using the same mechanism as to compress the BGP, as the Tony's draft says. The two comments to that. One is it proposes to remove the marker. While it works very well for BGP, save 16 octets, doing that for BMP, that will mean that it needs to cut out 16 octets out of the middle, and then you need to delinearize the message. And probably the cost of doing that will be bigger than the savings. The other thing is about when to restart the compressor. An important use for BMP is storing and replaying that data later. That means if you start a compressor at the start of a session, you need to replay everything from the beginning. Having a mechanism stating that you restart the compressor either at some amount of messages at some amount of seconds or something like that seems to be a usable functionality to have.
I see. First of all, thank you for your comments. We have definitely to look how to optimize this better, like you were essentially saying, not only compressing, but also batching things together. So we have just to study how to do that and propose something. To your other point, the when to restart the compressor. So in the draft, what we say is essentially that there is like, a router producing, BMP data, and then the collector has the compressor. So in a way, it's not this is not stretching to beyond that. Like, so you decompress it, and then maybe you have, I don't know, what? No. So essentially, you should not. So you should not save the compressed message. Should decompress it. But I understand that what you say is that you may want to save the actual raw message. I understand that. yeah, we have to see also.
Job Snyder's NTT. The topic of compression has come up in IDR, and it has not yet progressed to be a working group item. If it were to progress, it would concern me being an operator. Oftentimes, when it comes to internet routing, it can be of paramount importance to very, very quickly understand what the hell happened on the wire and what is propagating through the global routing system. And if we were to compress BMP messages, I would have significant concerns depending on how that compression is done, what the state of the dictionary is, how the dictionaries are exchanged, whether we would hamper our ability to very quickly react. Now, BMP, from my perspective, and this is just my view, is not the critical path. It is a telemetry or monitoring protocol. And if monitoring breaks, we are flying blind, which can be very unfortunate, but we're still flying in some direction. So I'm less hesitant to consider compression in BMP, but I will note that compression in BGP is, I think, in context of internet routing, a potential source for lots of problems.
Thank you.
Chaired Mach, Akamai. I actually haven't found the bandwidth used by BGP or BMP to actually be an issue in our environment. So I'd be interested in other operators who are having that as an issue to kind of share some data, in private. It doesn't need to be, from the mic. But I'm kind of curious on this because my sentiment is somewhat similar to Job's in, trying to do this. I'm very concerned about any delays in the messaging because we're trying to use the data for real-time event detection of, potentially anomalous or malicious actors. And I know compression isn't really that heavyweight, no more than any of the cryptos or anything else. But any delay is something that's very concerning to me.
Thank you. As an operator using BMP, I can just tell you that I totally share your comments. Like also for myself, I've not seen any bottleneck or anything. Like if it was for me as an operator, I would say almost, compression is not needed. But I have to note that, let's say, the topic of the amount of data being exported by the routers is something that really came up, like the first thing that came up in Chicago in 2017 with the Lockrib and Adribaut drafts. Like it's more a concern I'm understanding from the vendors and from the export, so on the exporting side. And this is something that I have heard, from multiple sources. So I would, I am also as curious as you, like if, to get more information why this is a problem at the exporting side. And that's it.
Thank you, Paulo.
Thank you.
Next up, Jeff Haas with an on-the-spot improvisation. Shall we put up a black slide?
Thanks for the time. So I hadn't intended to give a presentation here, but my commentary on pretty much all of these things that we're seeing for BMP is coming down to a lot of very common points. So I'll make the statement here, and then maybe, depending on exactly what the working group thinks, I can summarize it down maybe in an internet draft or on the wiki or something like that. So if I had to give a quick presentation, and I'm going to try to keep this much less than 5 minutes, it'd be architectural implications of PDU formats on router implementations. The big problem that we have here is that, and somebody was recently making fun of me online, BMP does have use cases. They have use cases beyond simple telemetry. We have certain very large service provider networks that are using them to power their SDN implementations. So things that slow that down make such vendors rather cranky. So there is strong need to be aware that these things are a little more complicated than just making the PDUs easy. Hackathons are very good for proving out, can you actually decode the formats? Can you actually do something with things? Is the format well structured? But it doesn't necessarily help you answer the question about, if I'm writing a BMP implementation that integrates with an actual BGP implementation, what's going on here? And to some extent, that argues that not enough of the right people are actually sitting at the hackathons as well. Thankfully, we have some people that can do both, and we should see about getting a few more of them involved in the hackathons as well. But the core observations really come down to a very small number of items. Item number one, this is basically BGP. Now, we do know from a lot of experience that BGP scales based on number of PDUs that get exchanged. Now, this is in terms of the protocol, in terms of formatting things, and to some extent a receiver. The receivers being in many cases general purpose PC type applications means that we don't have anywhere near the same impact that a actual router would. So that's less of a concern, but it does mean that the formatting side is still a problem. So what that means is that anything that degrades route packing, as we would normally do in BGP, can be a problem for the implementation. And this ties into the second problem, which is that the options that we're currently looking at for extending BMP are largely just tacking on this optional TLV to the bottom of a message. What that means is that that optional TLV needs to apply to the entire contents, a set of path attributes for a given AFI-SAFI, and some number of NLRI inside that package. If you're intending this information to apply to subsets of that NLRI, you are doing a forced deep hacking of the message. We can actually do something about this. We can actually change our format so that the TLVs are such that we have path attributes, we have NLRI, and we have stuff that is paired to that NLRI as telemetry. This allows us to do the job of allowing optional things to go in there without necessarily degrading the per packet case. The other thing that we have as a general problem in the architecture is that BGP is, that we're providing telemetry for. We have rib-in, we have loc-rib, and we have rib-out. Loc-rib is effectively an illusion of what the current routing table is, and the rib-in and rib-out in many cases have strong correlation to people's internal data structures. And this means that if you're looking to attach some sort of interesting state, if you're lucky, that state actually exists. So loc-rib is an example. Many implementations actually keep track on a runtime basis. Why did I not accept this prefix? This is one of the pieces of data people are looking to export. If you have that data, that's great. But the minute you don't actually have some piece of data and it's interesting to you and it belongs to the protocol, you are forcing the implementation to do one of two general things. Either extend its internal data structures so that state is tracked. That has a cost, especially in terms of memory. And if you're a real router, you're running it potentially on older hardware, the addition of a single word of memory on a common data structure can knock you over some of your limits. So you'll find from traditional router vendors a lot of hesitation to do things that end up being persistent state that gets attached to routes. Which leaves us pretty much for any of the optional mechanisms, there needs to be some way to very quickly attach data to the information. So rib-in is an example. If I want to know what bit of policy was actually doing this, can I derive it from the policy engine itself? Well, certainly running policy lets you get that information, but you probably don't want to take the hit of actually running the policy real time with this. And keeping around the state, just long enough to shove it down BMP potentially could be a problem, because who knows how long that state's going to linger based on back pressure. The conversation about why do we need compression is to some extent really about the fact that BMP is a socket. It's just a TCP pipe, just like every other thing on the planet. And that if you can't keep up with the data stream, you're creating back pressure on information that needs to be retained. So that's an impact as well. And if you can't derive, even if you can derive this stuff, that it needs to be attached a very quick basis, there's still a cost. You need to do some level of key comparability from one data store, in this case your ribs, which are highly optimized to make your BGP fast. to some data store that may not be very fast. And what we're doing in each of these different presentations is providing some level of annotation on these objects that are running around BGP very efficiently, and finding ways to effectively throw obstacles in front of them to make them slower. So my recommendations is that we try to remember that the core use cases do need to be kept and enabled. Now, this means that these things are optional features, hopefully, and stay optional, because some of these things, if they were not optional, I would have to tell some of our larger customers, don't use them. They will degrade your SDN use cases. For things that are optional, especially for telemetry type applications, that's great. Let's look at changing the format a little bit so that the information pairs better, doesn't break known packing things. And the last one is really a presentation layer comment. If we're going to tangle these things up, several of the things that we're actually talking about involve putting some sort of string on there. The fact it might be ASCII or UTF-8 is partially irrelevant. The thing that most of us who spend a lot of time doing performance measurements on our systems for things that need to be really streamlined, we know that scanf or whatever your language of choice mechanism for parsing strings or integers is very expensive. Just simply turning a prefix, an IP prefix in ASCII format into a simple 4-byte value with 1 byte worth of prefix, that gets expensive after a while. And ideally, you don't do that. So what this means is be very careful about deciding that, especially noisy information that may be very repetitive. If you have a set of reason strings that the router is going to say that I don't like this, don't send that reason string 10,000 times and make them parse it each time. Find a way, similar IP fix to exchange a dictionary that lets you say, here's what the string table is. I'm going to stick number 100 in here for this entry from now on. Make it nice and compact. Anyway, that's my comments. Some of these things probably should be written down, and I've actually pondered doing them for a general purpose BGP context, but some of these are very specific here. Thank you. Questions, comments?
You mentioned dictionaries, so would like a registry of dictionaries for strings be a positive solution to that?
That's certainly one way to go. So one of the things that have popped up in some of the presentations is like reasons why we didn't accept a thing. Some of these things are common behaviors that we really should be standardizing anyway. I think when flavor of this actually popped up in IDR, I think Yunan's original presentation, my commentary was some of these things absolutely, as a good value add, deserve a registry of here are common cases that we do things, and that should be maintained somewhere. But there's going to always be something that's proprietary. So like I may know something that's been rejected by a policy, and I want to actually add on a little bit of additional annotation based on my implementation. If that's a repetitive string, exchange the repetitive string as something you could just indirect.
Paolo Lucente, NTT. I wanted to ask you one question. If you remember, so this is on the packing part, the first point that you made. So that maybe the packing is not optimal the way in which it is at the very moment. If you remember in, let's say, last IETF in Montreal, I made kind of a, so we had the one draft from Hank Smith, right, originally, and then essentially it was not too complex, but let's say too long, too dispersive, and things like that. And so essentially we broke it down in a few sections. So one, we are executing the TLV part, maybe the easiest part, easiest but powerful, and things like that. Powerful in the sense that it can get some critical mass, more use case. It can a little bit unlock, BMP, right? Mm-hmm. And then there was another part which we didn't tackle, which is the restructuring of the message types. I think, we are all a little bit rotating around the fact that maybe we want to restructure this route monitoring message, mm-hmm. And things like that. So my question is, do you also see things in this direction? We need to restructure this route monitoring message and things like that. Would you like to be part of this effort? Shall we do it together and things like that?
Yeah, I'm always happy to contribute and I did tell you, a few minutes ago that you weren't done. This was part of why.
You mentioned that it would perhaps be good to write some of these things down. I would very much appreciate it if you did commit your thoughts to paper or keyboard and would share it with the group, because I think you are offering us foundational insights that can help us better develop protocols, and it is much appreciated that you are willing to share that with us.
Good. Thank you.
All right. I would like to entertain a motion to adjourn. Seconded. All right. See you in some other city on this beautiful planet. Thank you for attending. See you later.
One comment. We are 5 minutes short of 90 minutes. Are we proving we need 90 minutes for this working group?
We will definitely take that under consideration. Thank you, Paolo. I have to go.